So I sat down and watched Jujutsu Kaisen recently, and I found it unfortunately to be pretty mediocre. I know a lot of people really like it, and that I'm in a definite minority. To be honest, I can understand to some extent why it's so popular. It certainly has its merits. My aim is not to turn people against something they like, or bash a show relentlessly, it's just to communicate my perspective. I'm absolutely willing to engage with differing perspectives. There might be some things I missed, my argumentation could be flawed, or there could be factual errors within my video. I believe that well-placed criticism spurs growth in a way encouragement simply can't. Hence, why I'm making this video in the first place. Before we begin, please excuse my reuse of unrelated game footage. I'm not very good at either video editing or bypassing the Content ID system. I plan to experiment and practice a bit more so I can make the visual component of my videos more engaging, but this video is pretty long and I don't foresee myself having the time to edit it properly, especially as more or less a first pass at this kind of more comprehensive critique. I hope the script and voiceover alone are sufficient. The first 3 episodes showcase several of my core criticisms with Jujutsu Kaisen. These episodes are structured around tropes and plot points which will be very familiar to you if you've seen more than a couple shonen before. They introduce us to the main character, his rival, the female third wheel, the school, and the mentor, and they are all presented in a way that fails to introduce the unique elements of either the show or its characters. There's never a better example of Jujutsu Kaisen's inefficient use of its runtime than the first 10 minutes of the show, which are spent establishing Yuji's school life, intercut with brief scenes of a mysterious character who's looking for something at the school. This is meant to introduce how he comes into contact with the cursed finger that sets off the plot via the school's occult club and gives some glimpses into who he is. The problem is that it spends multiple scenes introducing characters in a setting which we'll never see again, only reveals superficial details of the main character, and waits until well over halfway through the first episode to establish its tone and visual language. His school and the occult club only serve as setup for the inciting incident, which could have been done in a way that wasn't so disconnected from anything in the actual plot. At the very least, they could have winked and nodded at how tedious these sections can be for a seasoned viewer, a la Kill la Kill. Very little would have been lost if this part were dropped entirely. It's not as though I don't understand what they're trying to do, setting up Itadori as an audience surrogate. Since the audience is mainly young teenagers, the idea is that they'll relate more closely to an everyman character who starts out like them and is gradually introduced to the fantastical elements alongside them. I tend to be very skeptical of this approach, though. I think it's just an inefficient cop-out taken by writers who aren't confident in their ability to write good exposition. Take as a counterexample the first episode from Chainsaw Man. Denji is distinct from the target audience, having his own goals, motivations, and who he is introduced alongside the concept of devils and the edgy, irreverent tone of the story. He's made relatable to the average Zoomer through his isolation and yearning for the kind of deep connection with another person that he's never been able to form. He's made relatable through concepts instead of circumstances. Visual iconography is used to hint at broader concepts and points that will arise later, and by the time he gets the chainsaw powers, the audience knows who he is and what the show is all about. When he's offered the chance to live the hedonistic life he's always dreamed of, we have enough context already that we'll know what he's going to do, and probably the journey he's going to go on as he learns that life is about more than money, food, and women. Chainsaw Man certainly has its flaws, but there is visibly more being communicated in the first episode that's just missing in JJK. About halfway through the episode, there's a laughably cliché and abrupt scene of Itadori's grandfather dying and saying he needs to use his strength to help people. I genuinely wonder how many people who watched this show even remember this scene. A desire to help people is not a bad motive to have, but explaining it away with the death of a family member feels like a cheap shortcut to emotional investment. Itadori is a simple character and didn't need such a melodramatic backstory. I think he would be a stronger character without this introduction, as we can derive everything we need to know about him from his actions later on. We can see that he wants to help people purely because he goes out of his way and puts himself in harm's way to do so many times throughout the story. His simple desire to help people is cheapened in a way by communicating it in the most blunt way possible. This episode falls into the same trap that many other shonen series do in their first episodes, going through the familiar 4 beats as if they're a checklist. That being the flash forward, then a cut back to the protagonist's ordinary life, then a family member's death, and finally the plot hook. usually the protagonist being roped into some sort of supernatural or superhuman fighting group to defeat the people or creatures that killed his parents or whatever. There are only so many times you can watch this play out in the exact same way before you need a little more than a checklist to get you intrigued. It would be impossible to tell what JJK is about or why people like it from the opening 10 minutes, and I can think of several shows where this is the case. I stuck with it because I wanted to make a video about it, but otherwise I would have dropped the series before the first episode was even over. Later that night, when Fushiguro steps in and explains the situation, it gets a little more interesting. The Occult Club guys are going to unseal the finger at the school. Fushiguro and Itadori rush over to save them from a monster drawn by the power of the cursed object. In order to save them and gain the ability to help more people, Yuji eats the finger, inadvertently absorbing part of an ancient evil spirit called Sukuna into his body. For this, Fushiguro intends to kill him. It still feels very similar to the last part of Demon Slayer's first episode, but I'm willing to let this slide because Sukuna is the centerpiece of this scene and he's easily one of the best aspects of the series, in sharp contrast to Nezuko being one of the worst aspects of her series. Remember how Naruto had the Fox Demon that functionally served as a source of infinite magic points? Here it's an actual character capable of possessing Yuji's body with his own goals, personality, and actions. I really like Sukuna as a villain because he takes something well-worn and tinkers with it to give it a unique spin and fit it into the story. I wish JJK did this more often. There's a great sense of mystery and menace whenever Sukuna is on screen, and there's a promise that the more fingers he eats, the stronger he'll become, eventually growing too powerful for Itadori to keep under control. Since the main goal is for him to eat all of the fingers and be killed by Goujou, the mentor character, to end the ancient spirit's evil influence forever, rising tension as the story goes on is pretty much guaranteed. I also want to add that the manga has a slightly stronger opening chapter, still not great, but it wastes less time than the anime on Itadori's boring school life. It probably just comes from the fact that the first episode adapts only the first chapter, and as such is required to stretch it out to 24 minutes. It's not a massive improvement, it is certainly more bearable. The second episode picks up as Yuji enters the school for Jujutsu users, practitioners of cursed magic. Our real issue with this show is that the writer seems to have wanted to include a lot of disparate ideas, mostly common tropes in the shonen genre, but didn't put the work in to tie them together cohesively. In these school episodes, we're introduced to Fushiguro Megumi, who bears an uncanny resemblance to Sasuke in both appearance and personality. We're then introduced to Goujou, the jovial and enigmatic mentor, who bears an uncanny resemblance to Kakashi. If the magic eyes, which he covers with a blindfold, weren't enough, he also has white hair which sticks up in clumps of spikes. The second episode is also the start of the part of the show I hate the most, the over-the-top comedic moments, which mostly consist of characters yelling and becoming chibi for multiple seconds at a time. This happens so often throughout the season that it really drags the tone down. Comedy in anime is ultimately a very complicated subject, which probably deserves its own video, but I think it suffices to say that the comedy in this show is neither funny nor fitting for the tone and themes of JJK. The interview between Itadori and the principal of the school, built up as some sort of test to see if he's worthy of studying at the school, made me groan a bit. Itadori shouts about his desire to help people as his purpose in life, and when asked why, he realizes he only wants to do it because his grandfather told him to. Then the principal calls him out on not having his own goal, which might be interesting if it went anywhere. Alas, Itadori passes the test through the sheer power of his conviction. I suppose the implication is that he decides to believe in it for himself for its own sake. It's like they wanted a big blowout fight with emotional investment early on, but didn't create a scenario to justify it, instead just taking a known issue from the first episode and doubling down on it, then forgetting it ever happened once the story begins in earnest. His grandfather is only ever brought up to remind people that Itadori in fact does want to help people. It might as well have just been a dream or a belief he held on his own. His actions communicate it well enough already, so I think the grandfather section was literally just a waste of time in an effort to emotionally manipulate the audience into caring about the story. This comes up a lot with the backstory dumps in JJK, but I'll get to that later. There is a small bit where the principal challenges Itadori's beliefs directly, but it's dropped as soon as he reveals his commitment to it. I think it would have been improved if that was what this whole scene focused on. The principal challenges Itadori's ideas on the basis of years of experience, the harsh realities he's had to face, being unable to save everyone, and sometimes being unable to save anyone but himself. You can still have a speech about his commitment to the straight and narrow, but the key difference is that this small change strengthens the characters and the themes. It shows Itadori standing up for what he believes, and it shows the principal having more experience and warning Itadori for what's to come. He'll be tested not only by his mentors, but by his enemies and the harsh world surrounding him. It wouldn't take much to make this scene pretty decent, a harbinger of what's to come, rather than an insubstantial fight for the sake of action and drama in an exposition-heavy episode. The third episode sees Yuji and Fushiguro being sent on their first mission together. This is our first taste of the main premise of the show, that is, the main characters hunting down cursed spirits in increasingly dangerous situations and having to face the harsh reality that they can't just swoop in and save the day. The ensuing fight against the cursed spirit is a decent showcase of Yuji's physical ability, and the cursed spirit designs and energy effects look great. They clearly had a lot of care put into making them look good and animate smoothly. However, this episode also introduces Nobara, the main female character and the third member of their trio. In stark contrast to the rest of the main cast, she is not similar at all to her equivalent of Naruto. Instead, the author seems to have taken a common criticism against shonen anime, that its female characters are rarely given the spotlight and mostly serve as love interests for the men, and committed an opposite and possibly worse error. Instead of having a crush on one of the main characters for no reason, she instead hates them for no reason. The only other characterization we get for her in this episode is Goujou stating that she's crazy. However, in practice, this just means she's annoying and irritable all the time. The worst part is that she's not the only character fitted into this mold. JJK fumbles nearly all of its female characters by avoiding problematic treatment of them more than considering what they can contribute to the plot. At least Naruto's female characters are involved in some way with the main characters. In JJK, they mostly stand around, bicker with the other characters, and occasionally take part in fights. We'll see this later in the tournament arc, where the viewer is subjected to multiple episodes of melodrama between completely peripheral characters that the audience has no investment in. The show still focuses mostly on the male characters, with its treatment of the female characters being fairly surface level and coming across as more performative than anything else. These first episodes showcase the biggest problems with JJK: inefficiency, lack of focus, and prioritization of tropes and cliches over creating an engaging story. While there are some interesting concepts and potentially interesting characters, these episodes are front-loaded with the most generic aspects of the show. It doesn't put its best foot forward, it just awkwardly shuffles in step with what everyone else is doing and hopes it's good enough. Episodes 4 through 7 on the whole are a step up. Itadori and friends hunt down a cursed spirit and see the sheer amount of damage caused and lives lost. He has to come to terms with the fact he can't save everyone. It also clashes nicely with the other characters, especially Fushiguro's more utilitarian viewpoint. The setup is predictable, but it certainly works. A concerned mother asks for them to get her son out of there, and Yuji finds the dead son and tries to get him back to his family for a proper burial. But he's confronted with the reality that they can't afford to be weighed down by carrying a dead man. This conflict is only touched upon, but it grounds the story and characters in a way that it rarely does. This is brought down somewhat by Nobara and Yuji going into chibi at the slightest prompt for multiple seconds at a time, but at the end of the facility, the boys get into a fight they can't win against a special grade cursed spirit, the highest level possible. It also kind of looks like Frieza from Dragon Ball. Yuji almost dies, but calls upon Sukuna to save him once his friends are evacuated. This part demonstrates that Sukuna is not only incredibly strong, but also highly intelligent and resourceful. The moment he gets control, he begins to work toward his immediate goal of roaming about freely. I've already discussed Sukuna's merit as a villain, and this is no exception. This arc culminates in a battle between Fushiguro and Sukuna, where Itadori's heart is ripped out and he is forced to accept a deal that results in Sukuna being able to possess him at any time for up to 1 minute. Itadori is then taken aside to learn the basics of controlling cursed energy by learning to control and channel his emotions. The way in which this is done, having him watch a ton of different kinds of movies while channeling cursed energy at a constant rate, isn't a nonsensical idea, but it is a little corny. It's at this point that Goujou is introduced to one of the main members of the villain group. Jogo, the cursed spirit which embodies the platonic element of Earth, who ambushes him along the side of a road. Aside from diversions to introduce Fushiguro and Nobara to some irrelevant side characters, these episodes are an okay build-up into the main arc of the first half of the season. The school sections, however, are just set up for the tournament arc later on, and they continue to contain a lot of obnoxious, unfunny jokes, which is foreshadowing for later. The fight between Gojo and Jogo lacks any tension or investment since it's heavily one-sided in favor of the heroes, to the point Gojo is capable of teleporting away and dragging Yuji there to watch, as he mercilessly beats up this incredibly powerful but helpless cursed spirit. Now I'd like to take some time to talk about the three main characters of the show: Itadori, Gojo, and Fushiguro. Some might count Nobara, but I don't because she rarely has any agency or focus. She probably gets a bigger role later on, but as of right now there's not much to comment on that hasn't already been commented on. I think Itadori is the best out of these three. He's very down-to-earth and sociable, and he plays the role well of a normal guy pushed into more and more twisted scenarios. We see him trying to make friends and help people out, not only by saving their lives, but also by talking through their personal issues with him. These aspects of his character make him easy to root for, even for someone as jaded as me. I'm sick of passive loser protagonists, and I always like to see Itadori being pushed to the limit of his morals. We see him juxtaposed with the other Jujutsu users because of these morals, and we see him taking action that most of the other characters wouldn't. Itadori also has, in my opinion, the best design in the show. He doesn't look outlandish and gaudy, nor does he look like an NPC with no identifying features. Most of the character designs fall into one of these two ideas. Unlike most of the designs in JJK, he strikes a good balance. He looks ordinary enough to work as an everyman character, but he has some small defining features that make him stand out. My favorite part of his design is his hood that just adds a little tinge of red to his school uniform and is used in battles as a source of secondary motion, which looks great in action. His face also has a solid range of expression, with the eyes in particular being given a lot of attention. Most of the characters don't get this treatment. One negative is how often he devolves into silly cartoon antics which really alter the tone. If they would have dialed back some of the chibi and shouting, like they do in some instances, it would have incorporated his more laid-back side better as a genuine part of his character. Itadori's simple but solid design suits him, and overall, he's easy to root for and connect with. He's the only character in this show that I really like, and I like him quite a bit. Next up is Fushiguro Megumi, the rival with a shockingly banal design. He's wearing the same tracksuit/school uniform as Itadori, but lacks any identifying features or marking, aside from his gold buttons and slight navy blue tinge. Aside from his blue clothing, he has spiky black hair, which makes him instantly reminiscent of both Sasuke and Vegeta. This would be fine if he had some identifying features that stand out, like the previous two mentioned, but he just doesn't. If you were to look at him, you might not even realize that he's supposed to be a main character. His characterization only draws further comparisons. He's annoyed with the more laid-back and playful attitudes of other characters, and he presents a very stoic and pragmatic front. He's a descendant of a clan called the Zenin, from which his power comes, despite that not really being that important in the first season. There's also a tease that Sukuna is planning to possess him at some point, but that hasn't happened quite yet. When it does, it might shake things up significantly, but I'll just have to wait and see. His abilities are pretty cool though, summoning a bunch of creatures like V from Devil May Cry, but overall, Megumi draws far too much from staples of shonen rival characters and doesn't bring enough uniqueness to the table to really stand out, aside from being the Sasuke of JJK. Gojo at least has much different characterization from Kakashi, despite his design basically being a one-up on Naruto's mentor. They have similar hairstyles, and Gojo wears a shiny purple tracksuit. He has a blindfold instead of a headband resting down over one of his eyes because instead of having one magic eye, Gojo has two. This single character causes so many problems for JJK that I find it baffling the fans seem to have latched onto him the way they have. His nonchalant nature is never held in check because no matter who he's with, he's always the strongest person in the room. Since nobody can get him to take anything seriously, the tone is dramatically lighter when he's on screen, aside from some of the more mysterious elements early on. The show constantly makes up excuses as to why Gojo isn't there in order for there to be any tension when the protagonists face a dangerous situation. This is played out physically when the villains create a barrier around him in the tournament arc, specifically to stall him long enough to carry out their plan. And even then, he flies into the air, breaks the barrier anyway, and then descends from the heavens, causing the villains to flee. For as enigmatic as he's supposed to be, there's very little mystery to him. The first time he interacts with one of the villains, and keep in mind, this is the cursed spirit embodying one of the 4 platonic elements, the spirit has to be rescued by one of the other villains. What starts out as mysterious due to his jovial attitude in the face of death soon becomes mundane and predictable as his motives and true intentions are never called into question. He's unequivocally one of the good guys, and he only jokes around like this because he's overpowered as heck. Goujou, in all honesty, would have been far more interesting as a villain, since his immense power, mysterious nature, and constant jokes would make him absolutely terrifying if he were in opposition to the heroes, rather than a literal and figurative walking deus ex machina who could probably defeat any of the villains in one punch. However, because Itadori is supposed to be dead from episodes 7 through 13, he's sent off away from the other characters, and therefore Goujou doesn't play a major role in the best part of the show. During this stretch, Itadori is mainly left to his own devices alongside a few senior Jujutsu users who lend him their perspectives and help him investigate a suspicious high schooler, Junpei, who seems to be a Jujutsu user of some kind. All the while, the main villain of the season, Mahito, is manipulating Junpei to get him closer to Itadori, as he wants to use Sukuna's power for an unknown purpose. Junpei gets his own school introduction similar to Itadori, although it actually does introduce his core traits alongside setting the tone for the arc. He's a depressed shut-in geek who gets bullied, and as a result he gets manipulated into helping the villains, as a way to escape from it. The enigmatic Mahito takes him under his wing, treats him as a friend, and grants him cursed powers to lash out at the world he perceives as having wronged him. As a result of these incidents, where several of his bullies are brutally murdered, he's placed under investigation by the Jujutsu school. In this case, we already know about curses and everything, so the story can afford to give us glimpses into the villains and their psychology, what their deal is, through the eyes of our new audience surrogate. I also really like the scene where Itadori sits down with Junpei and the two boys have a conversation about movies. It showcases the protagonist's laid-back and friendly nature. Even his more comedic side, as grating as it can be sometimes elsewhere, works really well here as a way to help Junpei come out of his shell a little. This is good. It puts the aspects of the character we know to use in a more relaxed situation. And on Junpei's end, it shows him what having an actual friend is like as opposed to being manipulated and used, although he doesn't realize it until it's too late. The best scene in the show, far away, is Mahito's crew trapping Itadori within Junpei's school, which kind of happens out of nowhere, but what happens afterward is pretty cool. Junpei reveals that he's been working with the villains the entire time, handing him over, and in that moment, thanks to Itadori, he finally realizes the true nature of the evil he himself has taken a part in. It's too late, however, as Mahito then transforms him into a cursed spirit, a husk of his human soul, barely capable of conscious thought. All of this was a ploy to get under Yuji's skin and allow Sukuna to gain control. Itadori's friendly demeanor and his desire to help people are leveraged as ways to break him down. I really wish I could have seen more of this throughout the season. It makes use of Itadori's down-to-earth nature, has him face difficult situations where sticking to his morals is the hard thing to do, and it showcases the futile feeling that he's just a pawn in a game between two powerful evils. We see just how far Mahito is willing to go to get what he wants, and how powerless Yuji is in the face of it all. The fight afterwards is pretty cool and is massively helped by the fact it's paying off a genuinely great moment. The usual flaws of this show apply here, but I can forgive that at this point because unlike most of the rest of the show, there's a decent narrative arc that knows what it wants to be and where it wants to go. I think that's the first step toward making something really solid. The rest of the season is caught up between trying to be a Naruto-like with the ensemble cast and power system, trying to be edgy and a little pretentious like Tokyo Ghoul, but also including a lot of comedy moments for some reason. Interestingly enough, Tokyo Ghoul also falls into this weird middle ground very early on. But here the ensemble cast is cut down to just the relevant characters. The comedy moments are kept manageable, and deliberate decisions are made with regards to the tone of each scene and how it fits into the arc as a whole. It isn't a great arc or anything, but it shows some hints of quality storytelling and craftsmanship, which I think is worthy of praise. If the rest of JJK was at the level of quality of this arc, I probably would have enjoyed it quite a bit. Unfortunately, instead of doubling down on its positives, after the halfway mark of the season, JJK takes a sharp 180 and nosedives into its obligatory tournament arc. In this arc, the Tokyo and Kyoto Jujutsu schools have their annual competition, and the setup is that the two teams of students are released into a controlled environment to hunt down cursed spirits. Whoever kills the most wins. This is easily the worst part of the show, a failed attempt to capture the elements that made Naruto's Chunin exam arc so beloved. The tone of this arc is far more light-hearted than before, and there's a lot more comedy than previously as well. If you ask me, escalation of the tone and themes are preferable over a random tournament arc coming after the darkest part of the show, but I do understand that the manga is more easily segmented into different arcs than a season of anime. First, let me break down why the Chunin exam, Naruto's most iconic arc, works. It's a pretty simple arc that puts the most emphasis on an ensemble cast and their interactions. Not all of the characters are interesting, but they are all distinct and play off of each other well. Over the course of the several stages of the exam, the characters are in various types of competition, at first cooperating in teams of 3 in a battle royale in a controlled area of wilderness, and later in one-on-one battles in a more conventional tournament. This allows them to form alliances, friendships, enmity, or push their already existing relationships forward. The rank of Chunin, the mid-level ninja, is a tangible goal only awarded to the top performers, and it drives everyone in the exam to succeed. It's also the first time Naruto and his friends interact with a large number of their peers, meeting fan-favorite characters like Rock Lee, Gaara, and Shikamaru. Even Naruto himself, a pretty shoddy character in general, has a few clever moments, like when Sasuke creates a secret password to distinguish whether they're real or illusions. He then discovers someone who's shapeshifted into Naruto later by the fact that Naruto would never be able to remember such a long and complicated password. The exam leans heavily on its large cast of distinct characters, letting dynamics form between them and taking the focus off of Naruto himself to show different characters' perspectives on being a ninja and their individual journeys. I don't like Naruto that much, but there's a lot in this arc that works. Not every fight in the Chunin exam is great, many of them were kind of lame, but the best ones had contrast and theming to them. They were like a miniature story unto themselves. The characters have clear driving ideas and morals behind their actions. Rock Lee wants to prove that even someone with no inborn abilities can be a great warrior. Shikamaru wants to slide by, doing the bare minimum, but being extremely talented. Neji wants to use his clan's special powers in conjunction with hard work to achieve greatness, and so on. These shine through in their interactions with each other long before their backstory dumps. JJK's tournament arc is basically attempting to be the same thing. It's a direct competition in teams between the two schools, where the focus is placed on a large cast of peripheral characters and their interactions. It even gets crashed by the show's villains, much like the Chunin exam. The problem is that, aside from being a tonal departure and featuring a lot more out-of-place comedy than ever before, most of the characters just have nothing to them. Take Mekamaru, for instance. He doesn't have anything special about him except that he's a robot controlled by a crippled dude in a basement somewhere. But functionally, this only really affects his design and how he fights. He has this whole sob story about how he was born like this, and then the panda has a whole speech about how they're the same because he was a puppet who was given life and free will or something, and I don't care anymore. Neither character has a personal goal. Mekamaru's team is just trying to kill Itadori because their teacher believes he's too dangerous to be kept alive, and Panda is trying to keep him alive because his superiors are willing to take the risk and stamp out Sukuna forever. This is what I mean by gimmick characters. Panda is literally just a panda. That's his entire personality. But at least he's laid back and reasonable, and that alone makes him more tolerable than most of these guys. For instance, there's the guy who has cursed speech. His speech is imbued with power, so he only speaks in ingredients for some recipe for fear that he might harm someone if he says something intelligible. He might as well have been mute though, except that someone somewhere thought it would be funny to have a character whose lines consist entirely of saying the names of food items, so here we are. I can't express in words how devastatingly exasperating it is to see a tense action scene where the camera cuts from some intense violence to this guy's face and he just says, "Tuna." Then there's the green-haired girl who uses a spear and has glasses. She's yet another annoying female character who yells at everyone and is angry all the time for no reason. She's not even the last one of these introduced. I will reiterate, JJK's female characters are incredibly poorly handled, and if you're praising this show for them, then you probably care more about what it isn't doing than what it actually does. The rival school's crew has 2 characters I found decently okay, but aside from that, they're just as bad. There's the girl who flies on a broomstick and is irritable and annoying to everyone. The girl who uses a gun and is annoying to everyone. The other guy I don't even remember. There's only one character in this whole cast of a half a dozen new side characters who I think comes close to achieving what they set out to do. Todo, the muscle man who simps over his favorite idol and shouts at people about their taste in women. He was annoying at first, but I came to find him somewhat endearing, since I like his interplay with Itadori. He's the only one of these characters who has this kind of distinct characterization, so he's able to play off the main cast at all, in a way the other characters in this arc simply can't. Even if he is mainly used for comedy, I think he works pretty well as a side character who befriends Itadori and imparts him some useful skills and advice. Now, most of these characters would be fine if they were background characters or just mini-bosses or something, but undue importance is placed on them. There are multiple episodes dedicated to each of these cardboard cutouts, and time is taken to give them backstories, so I can only assume that the intention was to get the audience invested in at least some of them. But because these characters are so insubstantial, they don't actually have genuine, deeply rooted reasons for personal conflict with another, so the writers most often just opt for petty melodrama. Because of this, I couldn't see anyone latching onto these guys in the same way they've latched onto the Naruto cast. The majority of this arc is just an excuse for flashy fights, and I was way beyond tuned out while watching. Stock standard shonen fights predicated on the flimsiest melodrama imaginable are just annoying at best and boring at worst. Many of the characters also have powers that are very poorly conveyed through the visuals, so a lot of the time they have to explain exactly what's happening when they do something. This kind of battle scene is heavily associated with JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, but there, the characters' powers themselves are simple and easily understandable, up until about part 4 or 5, with most of the explanation having to do with creative uses for those powers and overcomplicated strategies. When the villains break into the tournament, it's a breath of fresh air because the fight against them is actually pretty alright, particularly the plant guy that Itadori and Todo fight. He's got a cool design and cool powers, lending him a strong sense of presence. I didn't think the other villains were anything special, especially the guy obsessed with coat hangers for some reason. And the fact they had to create a barrier specifically to block Goujou out of the arena is really funny to me. Of course, Goujou swoops in and saves them all anyway when he easily destroys the barrier, but at least the damage is already done. The villains got what they wanted before they flee. I cannot put into words how much this arc sucks. It puts the villains on the back foot, has way too many characters with very little relevance or depth, derails the tone into lightheartedness after the darkest part of the entire season. All this for the sake of poorly imitating the most iconic arc of another fairly run-of-the-mill show from 20 years ago. The final arc, which comprises the last few episodes, is actually alright. This arc is mostly a pretty cool fight to wrap up the season, plus setup for things that happen later, so there's not much to comment on except that it has me cautiously optimistic about Season 2. It's still too heavily laden with comedy moments in its early sections, but it ends on the somewhat satisfying note of Nobara coming around to respect Itadori and consider him a friend, which actually makes her presence bearable. Overall, I was thoroughly disappointed. While JJK has potential, it retreads far too many well-worn and obligatory tropes to capitalize on it. These tropes were not even new or fresh when Naruto aired 20 years ago, and continuing to use it as a template has created a downward spiral of uninspired imitation after uninspired imitation. What sparks of inspiration and creativity there are in JJK are thoroughly overshadowed by this template. One noteworthy arc is sandwiched between a formulaic opening and a mandatory botched tournament arc. That's the most frustrating thing for me. It could have been good if it had dropped this formula altogether. Maybe condensed the series down to a dozen or so episodes, thrown out anything that doesn't add to the central core part of the narrative. I know this might be controversial among shonen fans, but I far prefer a story that takes what it does well and digs deep into it over a short runtime, than an unfocused mess of borrowed ideas that drags on for far longer than it needs. Elements like a school, a mentor, a rival, or a tournament arc can be used to great effect. Tropes are tools after all. But Jujutsu Kaisen's use of them feels more like a shackle which restrains the series from being anything more than mediocre. I hope it gets better in Season 2, I really do. But this first season was just not very good. Anyway, thank you for watching.